Formula One is officially back, baby. What's going on, guys? What a beginning to the 2026 season. The Australian Grand Prix is officially over, which means it is time for our first Grand Prix weekend reactions of the season. It's going to be a lot of fun. We got our quick hit section like always. We got our weekend winners and losers. We're going to go over the predictions that we made before the weekend began. We actually have a new segment this season where we're going to go over 3 big lingering questions following the race weekend leading up to the next one. And then we'll wrap things up by taking a look and see what is ahead on the F1 calendar. But what an Australian Grand Prix we had. It was eventful from quite literally before the race even began, all the way to the checkered flag. We're going to talk about everything that we saw over the course of the weekend, and we're going to get it started right here, right now, with our weekend quick hits. Where else could we possibly start about this weekend in the beginning of the season than Mercedes, who actually turned up this weekend, turned up the engine up to 11 and absolutely confirmed to us all that they have built an absolute rocket ship, not only over a single lap, but over a race distance as well. George Russell takes the win here in Australia. Kimi Antonelli comes home to finish P2 in dominating fashion, even given his poor start there at the beginning where he lost a handful of positions. It was a basically perfectly run race by Mercedes. George Russell officially begins the season with a win like many of us expected him to do. And at this point, I find it hard to imagine anyone keeping up, but we're not going to get too ahead of ourselves at this point in time. But I think it's safe to say that we all saw that smirk by Toto Wolff over the course in qualifying, and I think he and we all knew in that moment that it could be a long season, especially when it comes to the championship lead. So it is gonna be a season. We're gonna have it. There's definitely a lot of intrigue, but at the same time, Mercedes is clear out front, that's for sure. But while Mercedes was the fastest over the race distance, I think we have to talk about Ferrari, who have pretty consistently and solidly grabbed that second place on the grid, second fastest car. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton come home to finish this one P3 and 4, also relatively comfortably. And so while Ferrari definitely seemed to be lacking a little bit, both in one lap pace and in race trim, at the same time, they do seem to be a bit of a step ahead of those below. And so they find themselves definitely in the fight, but at the same time, it's going to take some special occasions for Ferrari probably to actually fight for wins. But at the same time, we saw they have their fantastic race starts. We saw both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton rocket off the line, Charles Leclerc taking the lead and battling for a handful of laps before Mercedes ultimately pulled away. But it was a welcome sight to see. I, for one, was a bit of a Ferrari doubter. After believing in 2025, they showed up in 2026 and said, hey, I'm going to prove you wrong. And boy, did they. It's all going to come down to development from here. But I think Ferrari have definitely gotten off on a much, much better foot than they have in years past. I think the next thing we need to talk about is the unreliability issue that we had poked up over the course of preseason testing as well as early in the weekend. This was a case that a lot of us were kind of half expecting, but we're also, I think, silently thinking it may not actually happen. So we ended up having a handful of DNFs due to the unreliability, having failures up and down the grid. Most notably, Nico Hülkenberg, who failed to start the race, Isaac Hadjar, who turned a beautiful P3 in qualifying, unfortunately into a DNF when his power unit gave up in the early portion of the race as well. You have Bottas, who ended up conking out about midpoint-ish and ultimately had to pull off and retire. And then you have Alonso and Stroll, who basically retired, but also didn't retire. Both of them had stints where they came into the pits, sat in the pits for 10 to 15 laps, and then went back out for portions. But then ultimately Alonso officially DNF'd, and I think Stroll technically classified, even though he was, I think, 12 or 15 laps down by the time the race ended. So Aston Martin taking advantage of whatever is going on with their car and, using a full-length Grand Prix as a glorified practice session. But nonetheless, I think unreliability is certainly something to watch, and it's going to be a thing, I believe, at minimum for probably at least the first half of the season, as these teams continue to grab data and analyze their units that they have in each car, trying to wrap their head around it and learn as much as they can. So something to watch for sure. It definitely kept us on our toes today, as you were never quite sure when someone would just be pulling off to the side in a very unexpected fashion. And while we did have a lot of unreliability DNFs, unfortunately, we have to talk about Oscar Piastri, who was an unfortunate victim of these new power units and ended up crashing out on his way to the grid pre-race. And so not only did he not get to take part in his home race, he didn't even make it to the grid to line up to take part in his home race. There seemed to be a surge in torque coming out of what would be, I think, turn 4 or 5 or something like that. And ultimately, he found himself backwards into the barrier at a rapid pace, and that was his day done and dusted. You have to feel not only for him, but all of the fans who had shown up and shown great support over the course of the entire weekend. Obviously, this is not the way you want to go out, and I think it's time we start talking about the Australian curse as a very real figment and staple in the history of Formula One, because man, oh man, I don't know if it could have hit him any harder. And then obviously with a new era of regulations, it comes with a new era of what Formula One looks like. I think we saw a lot of very interesting things over the course of the weekend, and none more so than the race itself. These cars have to be driven in such a unique and special way to make these cars go as fast as possible. And there was a lot of instances where I would see an overtake happen, which in years past, especially in the ground effects era, would be a surefire, overtake. They certainly would not be taking the position back immediately after. But in this race, on multiple times, if a driver used too much battery on an overtake and the defending car had a little bit left, it was more often than not a very good opportunity to come back immediately and take that position back. We saw battles like Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly down the entire second half of this race, with Esteban chasing down Pierre but unable to get the position done. Obviously, the George Russell and Charles Leclerc battle at the beginning of the race, which was fantastic to watch as a spectator. It is definitely something that in the grand scheme of things is not good, because these cars have to operate this way. But at the same time, at least through this first instance, it gave us some pretty exciting moments. So I'm curious to see what happens from here, but definitely worth talking about. And you couple that with the unreliability issues, and you end up with 7 constructors in the top 10 when it's all said and done, with both Mercedes, 1 McLaren, both Ferraris, Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, Ollie Behrman in the Haas, Gabriel Bortoleto in the Audi, Arvid Lindblad, who had a fantastic weekend. That kid jumped in and was on the pace immediately, and then Pierre Gasly rounding it out. So not only that, but a lot of young drivers as well, in Ollie Behrman, Lindblad, and Bortoleto, obviously rounding out the back half of the top 10. But it was a very exciting moment in terms of the constructors battle, because every team got a little sprinkling outside of a handful, but it was a little fun to watch. And so I'm very curious to see if this sort of thing can continue, because we've certainly been here before. All right, let's go ahead and move on now to talk about our weekend winners and losers. We will begin with our weekend winner, and I'm sort of going off the beaten path here. I'm avoiding the obvious, and I'm actually going with Arvid Lindblad in this one. I think the lone rookie on the grid actually showed up and really impressed a lot of people, not only probably potentially in his own team, but across the grid and online as well. I think I was one of the many shocked people who saw him show up pretty early on in FP1 qualifying, and then the race itself, where he showed a lot of really good pace and the ability to drive these cars in a way that really, I think, put him in a good position. Obviously qualifying in the top 10, reaching Q3, getting a fantastic start, running in P4, I believe, at one point. It was a fantastic day for him, and I think it definitely sets him up well going through this season. Obviously, it's only one race, so we'll see if he can keep it up, but I think seeing him jump out of the blocks that well definitely took a lot of people by surprise, me especially, and it's definitely put me on notice for him going through the rest of the 2026 season. Let's go ahead and move on now to our weekend loser. And again, I'm going off the beaten path, obviously ignoring all of the obvious ones, all of the mechanical DNFs. Oscar Piastri is a big shout. Of the people who took part in the Grand Prix itself, I'm actually, well, I say that, but I'm going with Isaac Hadjar in this one. Obviously, Max Verstappen crashing out in Q1 due to that car fault, putting him into the barriers. Isaac Hadjar, how does he respond? The second Red Bull seat allegations looming large. He puts it P3 in qualifying, and in the race actually was showing a lot of really good pace. He definitely was not necessarily on the same pace as the Ferraris or the Mercedes, but at the same time, he was running in a very strong position before, unfortunately, his engine decided to blow up. He was clouded in a cloud of smoke with no power, pulling off to the side of the road. And this is definitely going to be one of the what ifs, I think, for this season for me. I mean, it must have been a great confidence boost to qualify P3, must have been a very good confidence boost to get a good start and get a good position going forward. But then all of a sudden, for the second year in a row in his short F1 career, he is unable to complete the Australian Grand Prix. It's a rookie season because he crashed out on the formation lap. And in this season of the new era of regulations, his engine decides to go kaput. About now maybe even like a fifth of the way into the race. So it is a tough one for Isaac, but I think at least as of right now, he has shown a lot of really good pace. And you look up and down the grid, especially of those who had a mechanical failure, this one was, I think, one of the ones that took most people by surprise. So it's unfortunate to say Isaac, but at least to me, maybe this just has to do with my high hopes for you that you were running in those positions in the first place. But unfortunately, you are going to be my pick for the weekend loser here in Australia. All right, let's go ahead and bring in the community because it is time for our predictions results. That's right. And if you missed our weekend predictions video or our season prep video, this is a community predictions championship that we run here on the channel and in the Discord every week leading up to a Grand Prix weekend. I'll make a call for predictions that we make both here on the channel as well over in Discord. And when it's all said and done, we tally up the points and see who knows the most wheel by the time the season is over. I am the current reigning champion in the community, taking the win last season, and we are trying to start off on a good note this year. That said, it was a bit of an up and down week of predictions for me. I think I got a little overzealous, but at the same time, we're going to go through everything. But before we do, let's go over the points and how they work when it comes to assigning results. We try and promote scoring here in the community, and so we actually have two ways of offering and scoring points. Obviously, if you make a prediction and you get it 100% correct, you obviously will get a full point. You get a maximum of 1 point per prediction across everything. But at the same time, there are some special circumstances, mainly around our qualifying and our race podium predictions. Instead of only getting a full point if you predict the correct driver in the correct order, in the correct spot, we actually will offer half points. We make full predictions for both the podium and top three in qualifying. If you predict a driver to be in the top three, but they finish in the incorrect position, we give half points. There is also the occasional half points for our, biggest positive surprise, biggest disappointment, and one crazy predictions. But those are a little fewer and far between and more of a result of leniency and wanting to be fair to the community. And if you're interested in joining our community, it is never too early to jump in and prove that you know wheel. You can head to the link down in the description, join the Discord, and there is an F1 weekend predictions channel that you can drop your predictions and prove you know more wheel than anybody else. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on into this and get talking about our biggest positive surprise. I went with Ollie Behrman this week, in which I think was a fantastic pick. It ended up being a fantastic pick, except I called my shot and I said Ollie Behrman would finish in the top 6. And this had potential down the stretch of this one, but I say unfortunately he only comes home in P7, so unfortunately no points for me here. But Ollie Behrman absolutely with a fantastic weekend and definitely the right way to start the season, and we were one Max Verstappen and Lando Norris moment away from this one potentially coming true. But nonetheless, I'll take that one. It's a win-win for me. Either I get the point in predictions or Ollie Behrman has a good weekend but doesn't finish in the top 6. I think we'll take that every day of the week. As we move on now to biggest disappointment, and this was one where I was calling my shots. I think mainly because I was spurned by them last year. I went with Ferrari for my pick for biggest disappointment. Obviously, did not come true. They ended up qualifying decently and finishing P3 and 4 on the road. Very clearly the second fastest car on the grid, and not only that, they did survive some bad strategy calls, and so that just proves that they have the car under them to survive Ferrari strategy. So definitely cannot say that Ferrari was the biggest disappointment across the season. So even though I am the reigning champ, you can basically call me Lando Norris, as I am the reigning champ, but having a really poor start to the 2026 season myself. As we move on now to our qualifying top 3, I had Oscar Piastri P3, Max Verstappen P2, and George Russell on pole position. Obviously, only one of those things came very correct. George Russell did in fact take pole. Max Verstappen did crash out in Q1, and Oscar Piastri was solid, but unfortunately not good enough. So I grabbed my first point, and it was predicting a Mercedes pole position, and they did it very comfortably. As we move on now to our race podium, I went with a Lando Norris P3, an Oscar Piastri P2, and a George Russell win. Once again, believing in the Mercedes hype train, but I actually went in, and I might have just overcooked it a little bit in my head, but I went into this assuming that I think McLaren would be a little better than they had let on so far. Ultimately, definitely was not the case. It definitely looked like Lando was struggling to get truly up to speed. Oscar showed some pretty decent stuff over a single lap, and then obviously we didn't get to see what he would look like in race trim. So time will tell, but at the same time, maybe I'll ease off on the McLaren hopium going into next week. So. And let's wrap this up with our one crazy prediction. This one was another one that almost came in, and I was prepared to fight for it. But unfortunately, Lance Stroll decided to ruin things for me in a way that I cannot describe. Because my one crazy prediction is that we would see at least 5 mechanical DNFs in this race. And if Lance Stroll had not decided to come back out and finish 15 laps down, but classify in this race, I probably would have been correct. We would have had both Aston Martins, Isaac Hadjar, Nico Hülkenberg, and Valtteri Bottas, which would have given us 5. But Aston Martin decided, no, Stroll needs to finish 15 laps down. So unfortunately for me, no points there either, which means I round out our first weekend with 2 points to my name. And if we take a look at our current standings, they are pretty tight, except for the lead, because F1 Inferno has taken a commanding lead on 5 points to start this season, with British TTG and Spectral, a new entrant this season, tied on 2.5 points, and then me sitting in a lone 4th place with a very, very lonely 2 points to my name. So early doors, long season ahead, but at the same time, everyone else seemed to got a little bit more on pace than I was. So we'll see where we end up going into next time, but I believe, trust me. All right, let's do it. New segment here for 2026. I want to talk about 3 lingering questions that I have leaving Australia as we now head to China. And the first question that I want to cover is, how will these cars perform on that extremely long back straight in China? These cars were obviously struggling on that backstretch here at Albert Park, which does not bode well for these long run tracks like China, like Monza, like Baku. It is going to be very interesting to see what these cars look like going down that straight, and will they be doing 100 miles an hour because they have completely emptied their battery? Time will tell. Will they try and make up time by harvesting mid-straight? Who knows? That is definitely something I want to. If they're clipping this hard in Australia, what will it look like on a straight that is much, much longer than that? It could get hard to watch. That's my personal opinion. I don't know. Moving on to one of the second lingering question that I have is, will the reliability be any better? Obviously, the data gain in a race weekend is only going to be eclipsed by the first weekend. So that is where they're going to be learning the absolute most about these power units, about these cars, and what they can do to influence them going into the rest of the season. What are teams going to make adjustments for? Will we see Aston Martin actually show up and complete a weekend? Will Cadillac not have car parts flying off every other lap? Time will tell. We saw a lot of the suspected suspects have issues, but there's also the case of, will anyone else join them? Obviously, there was sort of spread thin and wide, but at the same time, that's definitely not to say that we won't see a new entrant into the unreliability chain of this season. So definitely going to be keeping an eye on that unreliability action, especially going to a track like China. And then finally, let's wrap this up with, will anyone be able to challenge Mercedes out front? Obviously, this is quite a broad question. Obviously, I think it is a little far-fetched to imagine someone actually truly challenging them for a win. But at the same time, I was pleasantly surprised at Ferrari's ability to battle them in the beginning. Was it a foregone conclusion that Mercedes would drive away? We actually don't know. With the virtual safety cars that came out, Ferrari ultimately ending up what ultimately didn't hurt them, but what many considered, myself included, to be the incorrect decision at that point, really never put them close to Mercedes again, and George and Kimi were able to just sort of drive away. And so Ferrari have definitely positioned themselves best to truly challenge Mercedes. I think the bigger question is going to be, who is going to make that first big step next? Obviously, we're probably more than a couple of rounds away from upgrades really hitting a lot of these cars. But at the same time, it's definitely a question that I want to keep an eye on, because we saw teams like Red Bull be very quick over a single lap, like Isaac Hadjar. We have teams like Ferrari who have figured out this, starting procedure magic that seems to rocket them off the line. And it's McLaren do seem to be a step behind, but we obviously have seen them build dominant cars before, as we saw last season. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Is this China specific? No, but I think we could see a lot of questions answered one way or another, but time will tell. And then last but certainly not least, that only leaves us with one question remaining. What is next in Formula One? It is a very quick turnaround as F1 heads now to China in but a weekend's time. We will see these cars back on track before we know it, as they head to China to race around the Lusail circuit. We touched on it a little bit. That long back straight going to put a lot of demand through these cars. It is also the first sprint race of the year. Whoa, they're back. And so not only is this going to be a challenging thing for these teams, they also have a lot less practice time to do it, as they'll have one practice session on Friday and immediately jump into sprint qualifying in the next session. Sprint weekends in years past have always yielded unexpected results. In a season like this, I think we could only see that amplified to the nth degree. And so it's going to get hot, and it's going to get heavy, and it's going to happen really, really quickly. Last year in the Grand Prix, it was a Piastri, Norris, Russell podium. George looking to, go back to back in podiums in China. Obviously, probably the favorite to put it on the top step, but that's why we go racing. You never know what's going to happen. Who are we going to see on the podium this year? Odds probably say Mercedes, but you never know. You never know. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one. I could not have been more excited for the first round here in Australia to finally arrive, to see these new cars on track, and to get some Formula One back on the television once again after a nice long break. If you've made it this far into the video, I appreciate you, and leave a like rating if you enjoyed the video, and we'll be back before you even know it to talk predictions for China. Guys, I would love to hear your thoughts on what you made of this first race of this new era of regulations. Let me know down in the comment section below. And if you're interested in joining our Community Predictions Championship, you can head to the Discord, link down below. Hop on in. We would love to have you. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I think that basically covers everything. But guys, I super enjoyed this one. I hope you did as well. And until then, I'll see you in the next one.